There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the absence of meaning. A dense emptiness suspended between who you are and who you think you're supposed to be. It's the silence that follows the feeling of being ordinary, of not shining enough, of lacking something rare, extraordinary, unmistakable. There's a hidden shame in that, a kind of secret humiliation no one admits out loud. The shame of being just another person. From early on, the world teaches you that simply existing isn't enough, that being loved requires standing out, that your worth depends on applause, that uniqueness is the currency of acceptance. In the smallest moments, a teacher praising the gifted kid, the pride in your parents' eyes when you excelled, the stories about special people, an unspoken narrative began forming. Being ordinary means failing. But the fear of being ordinary isn't just social, it's existential. It's born in the space between identity and emptiness, between the desire to belong and the desire to stand apart. It's the struggle of someone trying to prove they deserve to exist. In psychology, it's close to what's called vulnerable narcissism. Not the arrogant kind, but the constant fear of being insignificant. A type of narcissism born not from self-love, but from its absence. Social media magnifies this echo. Every face becomes a storefront. Every achievement, a performance. You learn to measure the value of your life through a silent comparison with lives that seem fuller, brighter, more unique. But the more you try to be special, the further you drift from your own presence. The quest for originality makes you a copy, a mirror of the desires of everyone else who also doesn't want to be ordinary. Your mind starts spinning in this paradox. The more you try to be someone, the emptier you feel. And deep down, what hurts isn't it not being special. It is believing you could only be worthy if you were. The fear of being ordinary is also a cultural inheritance. We live in an age where identity is treated like a marketing project. Be authentic, they say, while selling you ready-made templates for authenticity. The logic of exception has seeped even into the soul. Today, even silence has to be original. Even pain has to be aesthetic. Even suffering has to produce something. An insight, a poem, proof of depth. But beneath this aesthetic of uniqueness lies a quiet desperation, an unspoken plea. See me. Tell me there's something in me that doesn't repeat in anyone else. When this plea goes unanswered, it becomes a wound, the wound of feeling invisible. People who fear being ordinary don't fear anonymity. They fear being forgotten. They fear that their existence will leave no trace, that their life will pass unnoticed, that their death won't change anything. There's a near metaphysical terror in this, as if the soul were desperate to justify its own passage through the world. Many try to soothe this pain by producing, creating, chasing intensity, collecting experiences like symbolic trophies. But beneath these actions lies the same impulse, a deep fear of disappearing into the crowd. Psychology calls this unresolved individuation anxiety. The moment the mind realizes there is no clear line between the self and the whole. And the ego, startled, fights to prove it's solid. But what happens when the quest for uniqueness fails? When you look around and realize there are millions of people reading the same books, listening to the same music, having the same existential crises you once believed were yours alone. A quiet identity collapse emerges, the sense of being generic, repeatable, predictable, as if the soul itself had been mass-produced. This realization can bring shame, the shame of being average. And shame is a social emotion by nature. It exists because we see ourselves through the imagined eyes of others. When you feel ashamed of being ordinary, it's not your essence you're ashamed of, but the version of it you think others see. It's the social mirror reflecting back a dim light. But there's something cruel in this logic, because the constant need to be special destroys the shared sense of humanity. It turns love into a competition of rarity. What should be a space of connection turns into comparison. What should be presence becomes performance. Maybe the fear of being ordinary is really the fear of being like everyone else and what hurts the most. The fear of recognizing that everyone carries the same mix of fragility and longing. That suffering, for all its intimacy, is a shared language. In therapy, this fear often shows up in disguise, sometimes as perfectionism, sometimes as aesthetic or intellectual self-pressure. In other cases, as an inability to enjoy the simple, but in all of them, there is an unresolved childhood pain, the belief that you would only be loved if you were extraordinary. Psychologically, this belief creates an internal split. On one side, the ideal self, creative, brilliant, admired. On the other, the real self, vulnerable, confused, repetitive. And the greater the ideal self grows, the farther the real self feels. The shame settles in that gap. The mind starts to build narratives to cope. I just haven't found my purpose yet. My real talent is still dormant. My potential hasn't awakened. These lines sound hopeful, but they hide a quiet despair. Because the fear isn't not having a gift, it's not having meaning. At its core, the desire to be special is a desire to find a place in the world that confirms your existence matters. But what no one tells you is that meaning rarely lives in the extraordinary. It lives in the small, quiet things, in invisible gestures. The problem is, the ego hates the idea that something so simple could ever be enough. There comes a point when the person tired of proving themselves starts to fall apart. And that collapse isn't failure, it's release. It's the moment you realize you don't need to be admired to be whole. There's beauty in being just human. There's depth in being repeatable. Healing starts when your gaze turns inward. When the goal stops being distinction and becomes presence. When you realize your worth doesn't lie in standing out, but in being sincerely alive. In existential psychology, there's a term for this: ontological authenticity. It's not about being unique, it's about being real. It's the state of someone who accepts they are part of the fabric of life, without needing to be the brightest thread. And that's where fear changes shape. Because when you allow yourself to be ordinary, you discover something paradoxical: communion. The sense of belonging not through difference, but through sameness. You begin to see that the beauty of life isn't in what separates you from others, but in what connects you. Maybe the real miracle isn't being special, but being truly here, on the same earth as everyone else, breathing the same air, sharing the same awe at the mystery of existence. Shame then dissolves, not because you became remarkable, but because you learned to see yourself without needing to prove anything. The silence that once felt empty now feels like rest. The ordinary stops being an insult and becomes a refuge. In the end, what remains of you won't be how different you were, but how present. Because what truly leaves a mark isn't the one who tries to shine, but the one who learns to be whole. Maybe the fear of being ordinary was always the fear of disappearing before ever truly living. But life isn't a stage, it's a field. And fields don't ask for applause. They just bloom. Sometimes quietly, sometimes wildly, but always alive. You don't need to be rare to be real. You don't need to be remembered to have existed. Because existence itself is an invisible act of beauty. Each breath, an anonymous work of art. Each gesture, an imperceptible mark that time can't erase. There's a strange peace in accepting yourself as part of the whole, like a speck of dust suspended in a beam of light. Small, yes, but visible for a moment. And in that moment, complete. When you stop fighting against the ordinary, the world changes texture. Voices sound softer. The body feels lighter. Time grows less urgent. The extraordinary reveals itself where it always was. In repetition. In a routine that breathes. In a silence that listens. In a gaze that, for a moment, recognizes another gaze. Maybe being ordinary isn't the opposite of being special. Maybe it's the beginning of what we always wanted. The chance to be whole, even without witnesses. And when that understanding arrives, there's a nearly sacred calm in simply being. The fear fades, the ego rests, and silence returns. Not as an absence, but as a presence. In the end, maybe we're all just different versions of the same mystery. Temporary fragments of a consciousness trying to recognize itself in every face. And if that's what it means to be ordinary, then ordinary is just the secret name of the divine.